So welcome everybody. First, I would like to certainly welcome two special guests, and I will come back to our speaker, Gillian Thomas OAM, but also Gary Newton has joined us. Now you know him as the president of Geelong East Rotary Club. He is also Vice President of Polio Australia, and it's thanks to you, Gary, that you made the connection for me with Gillian, which I really appreciate. So thank you and welcome.
Thank you. You're very welcome to have that connection.
Thank you, Gary. So I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Gillian Thomas OAM. Gillian contracted polio in 1950 as a baby, which resulted in both legs and one arm being paralysed. Nevertheless, she learnt to walk with the aid of calipers and had mainstream education and employment. With the onset of the late effects of polio some 40 years later, her good, in inverted commas, right arm has become increasingly weak, and her mobility has considerably decreased. Gillian now uses a wheelchair, but is enabled by it, not confined by it. Gillian was a foundation member of Polio New South Wales in 1988 and of Polio Australia in 2008, and remains on the board and, as I said, is currently president of Polio Australia and of Polio New South Wales. Busy lady. Gillian has been honoured to receive a number of awards in recognition of her work for polio survivors, and most recently that was to be awarded the OAM in 2020 for service to community health. Would you please join me in welcoming Gillian Thomas. Gillian, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Leslie, and thank you all for inviting me. And it's lovely to see so many people here. I'm sorry I've got a bit of a cough at the moment. I will do my best to keep it under control. But, no guarantees, unfortunately. As you'll see, I'm wearing orange because October is Polio Awareness Month. And Gary, you should be wearing orange as well, you wicked boy. So we wear orange because we're still here, and that's the message that we like to give out. Anyway, when I find the right button, I have found it. I will share my screen. Okay. I'm talking today about a couple of things, immunisation and the late effects of polio. That's a picture, the first picture. Can everybody see it okay? Yeah. The first picture is, was it taken in the Great Hall in Parliament House in Canberra in 2012, quite well, 10 years ago now. That's me in the front. We were all wearing our We're Still Here t-shirts and we descended on Parliament. Very lovely picture, that one. And I've got to inflict some baby photos on you, I'm sorry. This first one is me when I was, I don't know, I was talking to Leslie today. I think I'm probably about 4 years old, with my mother holding on for grim death so I didn't fall over. This is me with my siblings. My sister also contracted polio at the same time as I did. It was just before Christmas, 1950. I came down with it first and she came down with it afterwards. But we were both in hospital in Sydney in isolation over Christmas. Many years later, through Polio New South Wales, I met somebody who knew me in hospital when I was a baby, and she'd actually contracted polio when she was in her late teens. So she was able to fill in a bit about my time there that I didn't know anything about. because my mother had died many years ago. And she told me that she remembers my mother standing outside and looking in through the window at her two daughters, but she couldn't come in and give us a hug. So I think that's a very, very poignant moment to actually learn that of my history. The third photo was me carrying the Olympic torch. It's hard to believe it was 20 years ago now, or 22 years ago. But that was a very proud moment as well. So, polio. I don't need to tell you it was one of the most feared diseases of the 20th century. It was, in America, they had the March of Dimes to actually collect as much money as they could to stimulate efforts into finding a vaccine, and also obviously to help treat people who contracted the disease. I know you probably know as much about polio vaccine as I do, or probably more, but I just wanted to do a little refresher because I was asked to address a particular issue about the vaccines in this talk. So just as a refresher, there's two types of vaccine. The first one is the kill virus vaccine, which is IPV, inactivated polio virus, the vaccine virus, which is delivered by injection. It was developed by Jonas Salk. It was introduced into Australia in 1956. There was actually an Australian connection with that as well, because Dr. Val Baisley worked with Jonas Salk in his laboratory, and he was instrumental in doing the early work to get it introduced into Australia when he came back here. So the Salk vaccine was actually overtaken or replaced by the Sabin vaccine in 1966. But as you're probably aware, the Salk vaccine has now been in use back in Australia since 2005. And I'll go into that in a bit more. And the oral polio vaccine, which is the one that I'm sure you're very familiar with, created by Albert Sabin, delivers a live weakened form of the virus to induce immunity. And the virus can't pass from the patient's gut to the spinal cord, and so it's quite safe. There are swings and roundabouts though, as I say. So the polio vaccine developed by Jonas Salk using the inactivated version is a safer vaccine because a dead virus can't mutate and come back to life. However, with swings and roundabouts, it doesn't provide as robust protection. And because the oral vaccine, being the Sabin, travels through the gut and offers local immunity and prevents the vaccinated person from becoming reinfected. However, the problem with the oral vaccine is that it can mutate and regain its ability to attack the central nervous system, and that's known as neurovirulence. This means that a small number of people who receive the OPV vaccine can develop paralysis, which has the same symptoms as paralysis from the wild polio virus. So this can actually occur in two different ways. The first way is vaccine-associated paralytic poliomyelitis, and that's if you actually contract it from the virus through a mutation, through a spontaneous mutation. But it's very rare, infinitesimally small, really. For every 1 million doses of oral poliovirus vaccines, there's been between 0.09 and 25 cases of VAPP. The other type of mutation is if they regain neurovirulence over a longer period, and that's known as vaccine-derived poliovirus. And what that is the, I think I've got that on the next one. Yes, the vaccine-derived poliovirus doesn't pose a threat to vaccinated people, but anyone who's unvaccinated is at risk. And as you know, the oral polio vaccine is typically used in developing countries because it's easier to administer and can be stored at room temperature. And it doesn't need people who are nurses or whatever to administer it. Even Gary Newton was able to do it. During the COVID pandemic, campaigns using the oral polio vaccine were disrupted. And as a result of this, because of vaccine hesitancy in some countries, like the US, the pool of unvaccinated vulnerable people has grown. And I was quite surprised to see there's been an estimated 20 outbreaks so far this year around the world, all from vaccine-derived poliovirus. And you've probably heard in recent news about the cases in New York and cases in London, well, not cases in London, but the virus is circulating in London. And it's not going to take much for it to take off again. Anyway, getting back now to what polio is all about, and you may know all about this as well, but it doesn't hurt to go through it. Polio spreads via the fecal-oral route, and in some cases it invades the nervous system. That's when it transfers across into the spinal cord. And when it does that, it interrupts or it kills off motor neurons, which results in a lack of nerve supply to the muscle. Now, out of between about 0.5% to 1% of people who contract the polio virus actually get the paralytic form. So I was a really lucky girl because I won that lottery, the only lottery I've ever won. And what happens is when the polio virus attacks the muscle, it kills off these nerves. The grey one in the third picture is the motor neuron that's been killed off. And if this thing would work there. What happens during the recovery phase is that nerves that weren't killed off, they actually send out sprouts to the orphan nerves, and they re-innervate the nerves, so that's why people get movement back. So it takes 6 to 12 months to actually get that back. And we thought, well, that was it, we got our function back to a greater or lesser extent. Obviously, if you ended up and won the lottery and got paralysis, it was irreversible. But to some extent, we did get some movement back. About 5 to 10% of people with paralytic polio died, predominantly because their breathing muscles were affected. Some people, as you've probably heard, had to spend the rest of their lives in an iron lung so that they could breathe. Rotary International has got, or Rotary in Australia has a very long history from the earliest 20th century in helping to establish community organisations to support Australian children and adults living with polio. New South Wales Society for Crippled Children that I was associated with for many years in Sydney. They were set up in 1929 thanks to Rotary's efforts at that time. They actually went door to door asking whether there were children. They were looking particularly at children with cerebral palsy and people with polio, and set up support organisations for them. And obviously we very warmly acknowledge, Polio Australia particularly warmly acknowledges the incredible work that Rotary International and all of you who support Rotary International have done to getting so close to finally eradicating polio, because without you it would never have happened. However, there is something else that Sir Clem Renouf said in his original Rotary International resolution, that it was the eradication of polio and the alleviation of its consequences. And that's what we take to mean at the time, what we took it to mean at what Clem was referring to was all those kids who'd actually got polio and were actually then suffering from the after effects of it. What Clem didn't know at that stage, and we didn't know as children, was that there was a sting in the tail of the infection, and that sting is known as the late effects of polio. So after we recovered our function and got on with life, went back to school, went to work, got married, had kids, all the rest of it, 30 to 40 years later, we started getting new problems. We started having more weakness, especially in muscles that we thought weren't previously affected. We started getting fatigue that we couldn't explain, a whole spectrum of symptoms that we were having that we didn't know what was causing it. We now know that that is the late effects of polio. And there are thousands of survivors of polio in Australia with varying degrees of residual disability. I should say, I said earlier that 0.5 to 1% get paralytic polio. However, that is just the tip of the iceberg, because there's another 99.5 99% of people who have contracted the polio virus. Some of them won't have even been aware that they contracted it. They could be asymptomatic. Some of them would have had a mild illness, might have just had a flu, been off colour for a few days. And some people did get quite sick and then recovered without any apparent difficulty at all. My sister, for example, she didn't show any residual disability, and yet we contracted polio at the same time. She was 3 years old at the time she got it, so perhaps she was a bit more able to fight it off than I was. I was only 10 months old. So what are the late effects? Well, the new symptoms. It's new and increasing muscle weakness, debilitating fatigue, chronic pain, breathing problems, sleep disturbance, speech and swallowing difficulties, cold intolerance, and a whole pile of other exciting stuff. So it's not something to look forward to. There was a lot of debate in the early days after this syndrome was first talked about as to what the cause of it was. But the consensus now seems to be that the nerves that sent out the additional sprouts to the orphan muscle fibres are now dying off. They're doing much more work than they were ever intended to do. They just can't cope with the load for the length of time that they've been expected to cope with that load. So it has been said that a polio survivor is actually about 20 years beyond or older than our chronological age, which is why 72 I feel more like a 92-year-old. So as a result of that nerve fibre dying off, the nerve dying off, then that's what we're getting, the increased weakness. And the reason that we're getting weakness in muscles that we thought weren't originally affected was because when the polio originally infected us, if it killed off fewer than 50% of our nerve fibres, then we didn't really perceive that as paralysis. It was a little bit weaker, but we didn't particularly notice it. But as we age, we drop off. Everybody drops off nerve fibres anyway. And as we age, we're now getting over that 50% limit. And because we've now got over that 50%, up to 60 or 70%, then we're really noticing it and becoming very weak, much weaker than we would with our, age peers who didn't have polio. So back in the 1980s, there was the late effects of polio were starting to become more commonly known. In America, they were holding a couple of conferences about it, and some people from Australia went over to a conference over there, and somebody from over there came over, Professor Irving Zola, came over to Australia in about 1986 and gave a lecture. And in fact, as I said earlier, I was associated with the New South Wales Society for Crippled Children. They sent me a letter and said there's going to be a seminar on the late effects of polio, and I rang them up and I said, late effects of polio, what's that? It was the first I'd ever heard of it. So I went along to that lecture, which was very interesting. I hadn't seen so many polio survivors in a room before, because what we did was we went back into the community and we really didn't associate with other polio survivors. And a lot of the time we may not have recognised the people as polio survivors anyway. But in this particular room there were so many polio survivors, I couldn't believe my eyes. And towards the end of the afternoon, they asked people to put their hands up and said, oh, we think we should form a post-polio network so that we can get some information about what's in store for us and what's happening around the world about this. And so, silly me, put my hand up, and 30-odd years later, 35 years later, I'm still here. So basically, the networks were established in all the states there through to the 80s and the 90s, mostly peer support groups staffed by volunteers on the smell of an oily rag. And we've been providing information and support services, holding local support groups, and as I said, staffed by volunteers. So after a while, I got the idea that we probably needed a national organisation, and so I started stirring up the other states, and eventually in 2008 we established Polio Australia to form a peak body. So we haven't been going all that long. What our current programs are, we provide, sorry for the typo in that dot point, we currently provide education to health professionals across Australia and to polio survivors and their carers about the late effects of polio. We do that through two different programs. One is the polio community education. So polio survivors and their carers, we go out and run community information sessions basically. In fact, our community development worker is in WA at the moment doing a series of talks over there. After funding that through donations, we've recently got some funding from the Federal Department of Health to fund that program for 3 years, which is very good. The other side of the coin is it's all very well educating the polio survivors. We've also got to educate the health professionals, because the problem is that they don't learn about it in their university degrees. They don't recognise that they weren't around when the polio epidemics were around. So we also have to train, educate health professionals in how to recognise, how to diagnose, how to manage people who've got the late effects of polio. And we were very fortunate to have that program funded for 5 years. Unfortunately, that funding ran out in June this year. We've been lobbying very hard to try and get that funding reinstated. In the meantime, Polio Australia has taken it upon itself to fund the program ourselves, hopefully for not more than 6 months, because we don't have very many resources to do it. But the problem is that we have got staff. We have a full-time physiotherapist who runs the program, and he's got a mortgage to pay and a family to look after. He can't afford to work for us for nothing. So if we can't get funding to keep him employed, we will lose him and we'll lose his expertise, and we'll be back to square one. We also need funding to meet the ongoing cost of providing information and support services, which is our web-based resources. The Australian Polio Register, which I actually set up in 2010. We have a quarterly publication. We have quite an extensive number of resources for polio survivors and also for health professionals. And we lobby federal government to improve health services, not only give us money, but to actually improve the way the health service and the whole health system responds to the needs of polio survivors. So this is just a couple of photos of a health professional education session. And this is one from a community information session. We run both those programs across Australia. Website resources, we have a lot of resources on living with polio. We also have a health professional register where people who've had training through our health professional education can register their details so people can talk to a polio or aware practitioner. We have the Australian Polio Register I mentioned before. The problem is, or a problem is that when the vaccines came in, polio was considered to be a solved problem because they thought, well, that's the end of it, there'll be no more people getting polio, and that's true, there wasn't. But what nobody realised was that the late effects of polio were going to come along and that people might want to be able to connect with other polio survivors. Unfortunately, a lot of the health records, the hospital records, were all thrown out, destroyed. They just didn't see the need to retain them anymore. And so it's meant that there's all these polio people out there in the community that we have no way of contacting. And because we operate on the smell of an oily rag, we can't really do great big publicity pushes. So we just have to rely on people actually finding us through our social media, through our websites, through any publicity we can get done. It's been a hard slog over the 35 odd years that I've been doing it. And so one of our, there's young Gary. That was an appropriate slide to have in there, Gary, wasn't it?
Oh, thank you for mentioning me there, Gillian. That's very nice.
Yeah.
That was me in India some years ago.
It was. And we have resources. The Low Fix of Polio is an introductory module, and that's free of charge, and which anybody can download. It's written for health professionals, and lay people can read it as well. It's just had a total revision, and the second edition's just been published. And the other one, the Managing Muscles and Mobility, is we actually charge for this one to health professionals, but anybody who comes along and does our training session gets a copy as a perk of doing the training session. So what can Rotary clubs do? Well, you know, I'm never averse to holding the little bucket out, and considering annual support to us is always a wonderful idea. You could partner with us to fundraise and raise awareness. We're actually lighting up Australia orange in Polio Awareness Month, so if you know of any landmarks in your areas that would like to light up orange, we're trying to keep it away from World Polio Day because they light up purple for World Polio Day. It's a clash of colours. Join us on Facebook. And for more information about the late effects of polio and how you can support us and what we can do for you, you can contact us at any time. And I think I've done my dash.
Thank you, Gillian, so much. Now, I'm quite sure there are questions, and please put them into to chat, raise your hand on camera or electronically. But Gillian, thank you so much. I'm quite sure that everyone learned a lot. I certainly did from that. I cannot imagine what it was like for your mum to be looking at her two daughters with polio through the glass and not being able to hug you or even just come in and talk to you.
Yeah, it must have been horrible.
So could I start, please? You mentioned a couple of times that some people didn't ever know they had polio. They were asymptomatic.
Yes.
Is there any information or data suggesting that they are experiencing late onset polio effects?
Yes, a certain number of them. Maybe. I mean, we don't have exact figures. This is the biggest question we always get asked is, but how many polio survivors are there in Australia? And the short answer is we simply don't know. Because the records were destroyed, we're basically extrapolating from the death rate, noting that 5 to 10% of people died from it. And so it's estimated that there were 40,000 people who contracted polio that's paralytic polio. So we're looking at a hell of a lot more people who didn't get paralytic form, and that's a whole spectrum for people who were totally asymptomatic and didn't have any side effects from it, and to the people who were really quite badly affected. But we just don't know how many people. We've tried to get some research done on it, but it's in the too hard basket from the people that we've approached so far. But we know they're out there because anytime we do any publicity, people just come out of the woodwork.
Yes. So are there questions from anybody, please? So I've got a question here in chat from Phil Beasley. Gillian, could you explain why the polio vaccine, was reintroduced sometime after the oral vaccine had been successful, so the injection form?
While we went back to the
injection.
Yeah, okay. Basically because of the fact of the mutation of the oral vaccine, although it's a small, a very small possibility of it, it was felt that it was a safer option to in a pretty well fully vaccinated community to go back to the inactivated polio vaccine. We went back to it in 2005. USA, New Zealand, all those other developed countries also did the same thing and went back to it. It was also at a time when they were developing some other vaccines. I can't quite remember which one it is, but it's now, Gary might be able to help me out. It's now it's combined with other injectable vaccines. So although they don't like giving kids too many needles, it's now combined in with these other vaccines, which means that really it's one shot, which actually protects kids against a range of diseases. I don't know if you've got anything to add to that, Gary.
No, I can't really add too much to that other than what I've read it from the eradication.org website, which talks about a new vaccine that's being developed, which will be an oral polio vaccine,
oral one, yeah.
but it'll be a much safer one, from what I understand. That's really all I know.
Yeah.
Okay, so Sue Curry is asking, does polio only affect limbs?
Predominantly the lower limbs, although not exclusively, because I'm a case in point. It can affect just about every muscle in the body. It doesn't seem to affect the heart. And I have heard it told that it doesn't affect the tongue. We don't shut up very much.
Thank you. From Martin, is there a basic blood test done to show if you could possibly be a late onset polio person?
Unfortunately, no. The diagnosis of the late effects of polio is by what's known as a diagnosis of exclusion. So because the symptoms of the late effects, fatigue, muscle weakness and whatever, can be common with a lot of other diseases, like heart disease or cancer or other nasties, you actually have to exclude all of those before you can actually conclude that the problems that you're having are related to your polio. So in that case, sorry, just being interrupted, problems of living in a nursing home. Yes, so it's a diagnosis of exclusion,
Yes.
and there's no simple blood test that you can have to say, yes, that's what you've got.
And a note from Ian Campbell, who is a guest with us tonight, and thank you, Ian, for telling us that you're a polio survivor. Maggie Arson, you have your hand up.
I did write it on the chat thing, but Gillian,
Oh,
thank
sorry,
you.
I didn't see it.
Thank you for that amazing presentation. How can we as a Rotary Club and a district contribute to more awareness about late onset polio?
Well, I think you'll probably find that you've got a lot of members that you aren't aware have got polio. It's always a good place to start. You can contribute by working with Polio Australia. In fact, it was a Rotary district in New South Wales that actually kick-started our clinical practice workshop program, because they actually, the number of clubs in the district kicked in $2,000 each and actually got us a budget so that we could employ somebody to deliver the first clinical practice workshops to health professionals. And that's what gave us some runs on the board and what helped us to get the federal funding. So the other way that you can help to spread awareness is whenever you're talking to people about the polio eradication, just to keep in the back of your mind all the time that it's the consequences of polio as well. That if you don't eradicate and if you get polio, that's not the end of the story. It's a lifelong disability, and it's.
Thank you. Thank you. One of our members has got polio, late onset polio symptoms. In fact, can't use his left hand at all. But I think we also sort of focus on the international, you know, the India problem, having been to India. And I think this has been so inspiring for me because we tend to kind of not realise that there's this polio late onset group that you are such a part of, and thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, and it's not only people who are in Australia, we've also got a number of younger polio survivors who've emigrated to Australia from countries where polio was only more recently eradicated. And so it's not just all us old fogies that are, you know, basically about to shuffle off our mortal coil. There's a lot of younger polio survivors in the country as well.
Yeah. Thank you.
And we're probably, I'll take Ben's lead here. I'm not sure how much time we have, Ben, but I would like to just ask Gary Newton if you'd like to say anything, because I do know last year's World Polio Day event you organised, the funds that were raised at that were split between the End Polio campaign and Polio Australia.
That's right, Leslie. There were. And that video that was created with the interviews from various polio survivors in America, in Canada, and in the UK, was well received. It probably didn't create as much interest as I personally would have liked, from the point of view of raising funds for both parts of the polio story, the eradication and the alleviation of the consequences. That is, supporting the work of organisations like Polio Australia in particular. But we are going to do something in a couple of weeks' time, and I hope that everybody will come on board and support it. It is a follow-up to an effort from Ken Hutt earlier this year, who in May climbed Mount Everest and was aiming to be the first to paraglide from the summit of Mount Everest in support of the polio eradication initiative. Dr. Joe Carter from the Queensland University went with him, and they made a movie, and we're going to be showing that movie on the 23rd of October at the Geelong West Town Hall. So for everybody who's in Geelong, if you would be so kind as to, and I know that it's gone out quite widely, thanks to Pauline Stewart and other club secretaries and presidents via the newsletter, etc. If you could jump online and book a ticket for that, I would be very, very appreciative of it, because we've got very low numbers at the moment, and we need to get some big numbers in there, because we've got both Ken and Joe coming to be involved in a meet and greet. We're going to show the movie.
Oh, wow.
And we're also going to have an Indian afternoon tea provided by the Somali Women Development Association. So we've got a lot of things lined up, but we haven't got a lot of people in seats just yet, or even planning to be in seats. So if you could support that, and that would be a great step forward in helping to create more awareness for polio and the eradication program, Polio Plus.
Thanks, Gary. Ian Campbell, did you want to say anything?
Yeah, I thought that I'd escaped scot-free as a polio survivor. I did a lot of bike riding when I was younger, but I notice now in my dotage that my left leg, which was where the polio was, is considerably thinner than my right leg. And I was just wondering, was exercise supposed to improve recovery, or was it basically didn't have any effect? I'd be interested to know.
You're saying exercise when you were younger?
Well, I do a lot of bike riding now. I probably do 100 kilometres a week with a view to keeping active, but I was just wondering whether it is good to recover from polio and prevent late onset, or is it detrimental?
Well, that's a big question. Basically, what we should be doing with exercise is, obviously, you have to be careful not to overwork the muscles that are weak. So the trick is to exercise the muscles that are capable of being exercised, and the ones that are too weak to be exercised, you should be keeping right away from exercising them, because you actually may do more damage than good. You need to be assessed by a polio-aware physiotherapist who has had training from Polio Australia's health professional to actually work out the best sort of exercise routine for you. That's the best advice I could give you. There's no really one size fits all with it. For example, with my right arm, I have to be very careful with it because it's all I've got. So if I overwork it, then I'm really wrecked. So I'm very cautious about what exercise I do on it, but that doesn't mean I don't do any exercise, because that's just as bad. So it's striking the balance where you do enough exercise to keep your cardiovascular system and everything else as healthy as it can be, but at the same time make sure that you're not overworking those cord motor neurons that are already overworked.
Right.
I don't know if that
Thanks,
helps.
Gillian.
No, thanks for the question, Ian. I'm going to take just one more question, and that's Gail Crisfield. Best if you ask yourself. You put quite a lengthy one piece in chat, but you might be able to just ask that question, please.
Okay, sorry.
Assuming.
Yeah. So I was just listening to you, Gillian. Diagnosing late onset polio sounds exactly like the process you go through to try and diagnose chronic fatigue, which I've been through. And that is by the process of exclusion, you know.
Yep. Yep.
And I'm still not convinced that when I was diagnosed, they got the diagnosis right. But anyway, so if you don't know you've got late onset polio, and you did say previously that we may have members who may have polio and aren't aware, you know, what are the symptoms, and would the other thing I'm curious about is, would the oral vaccine mutation actually contribute to late onset polio?
I think the short answer to that's no.
Okay, thank you.
But I'm not a medical person.
Yeah.
I should hesitate to say, I should hasten to say, not hesitate to say. And I'm sorry, my brain died. What was the first part of your question?
It was if you don't know you've got, like when you were saying that we may have members who could have polio and aren't aware of that.
Yes.
What are some of the symptoms that could suggest that you may have late onset polio, or that you may have polio that you're not aware of?
Yeah, it's a difficult one, and I'm sure there are a lot of polio survivors who have actually been diagnosed with chronic fatigue, who in fact don't have chronic fatigue, but they have the late effects of polio. Especially if you had a sibling or a relative, a cousin or whatever who had polio, because if polio went into a household and one of the kids got it, chances are it went right through and all the kids had it, but not all of them would have been diagnosed. For example, my sister was. My brother wasn't, but he could well have got it as well. So it is difficult, really. It needs to be a detailed history taken of any childhood illnesses that you might remember having, and talking to your parents if they're still around about any illnesses that you might have had. And you can get some nerve conduction studies done to see whether or not there's polio damage there, but that can be a bit hit and miss. You can see if you've got antibodies, but then they're also generated by the vaccines, so that doesn't really help you either. It's a difficult one.
Okay, thank you very much for your answer.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Gail. Gillian, I'm going to thank you again. Some of the sorts of, there's quite a few comments in chat that refer to you as what an inspirational person, fascinating, informational, just engaging topic and presentation. And I just thank you from the bottom of my heart for taking the time to spend it with us at Torquay Rotary and sharing your knowledge, your experience and your life with us. If anyone does have other questions, feel free to send them through to me. I will make sure Gillian gets them. I will also put Polio Australia website into the article that we'll put onto the bulletin. As I said earlier, this presentation has been recorded and we will be able to make that available if anyone would like to use it further as well. So could I ask everybody please to thank Gillian again, and I'll pass back to President Ben.
Thank you very much.
Leslie, thanks so much. And Gillian, can I echo those thoughts from Leslie? Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks for educating us, so we are more understanding, and I think it helps with what work we're doing, the more we understand, so thank you again. So all external guest Rotarians, that ends the formal part. We have our club business now.